Hey guys, it's Merkai here, and today I'm going to show you a couple of watercolor techniques that I've learned in the past year that I use fairly recently, and I hope this video helps you out if you're just starting in watercolor, and I hope you all enjoy. So the first processes that I'm going to show you, or techniques I'm going to show you, are your two basic ones, which is wet on wet and wet on dry. Now with wet on wet, what you do, as you can see, is you first take a clean brush and wet your paper, and then take the color you want and put it on top of the water, which makes like a cloudy look to it. The next one is the wet on dry technique, and you basically just take your wet paintbrush and your paint and you just put it on the paper without the water on the paper, and it gives you a much harder look to it. The next technique I'm going to show you is the wet on wet with tissue and the wet on dry with tissue. Now with these two, it's basically like the wet on wet and the wet on dry, but you take a tissue and you dab onto it to absorb the watercolor. Now depending on how long you leave the watercolor sitting will depend on how light or how dark the color is on your paper. I had to stop the video and let them dry for a little bit before I could take them off, because otherwise the paper would just be white, and I didn't wait very long, maybe 5-10 minutes. So the next ones I'm going to show you is basically just wet on wet with two different colors looking. I chose blue and purple because blue and purple are very complementary to each other. They go in well and they blend fairly nicely, I think, and they're also like my favorite colors. I use too much water on this, and watching it just makes me sad. I'm like, Ray, what are you doing? Stop it. Get some help. I'm trying to absorb the water. I've realized what I have done. I have made grave mistakes. Anyways, I have nothing to talk about, because I just explained to y'all what I'm going to do. I'm so awkward. I'm just trying to do a voiceover. Why? So on the next one I do, it's basically like just the wet on dry, and I also use blue and purple. I used blue and purple throughout this whole thing because I wanted y'all to see the difference in the techniques that you use, so that it's not like a bunch of different colors and it's all messy, and you can actually see the differences. So with this is the wet on wet with the two different colors and the tissue technique. And so I basically just mixed them together and had to sit there and watch YouTube while it dried. And I did the same thing with the next one, which is the wet on dry technique with the colors and with the tissue. And like I said, I also use blue and purple because I just love blue and purple. Look how nicely that just, oh man, it's orgasmic. So I had to sit there and let them dry. Anyways, so the next technique I'm going to show you is the dry brush technique, which is basically you have your wet watercolor and you dry your brush almost completely. You take your watercolor and put it on the page, and it's nice for if you want like a hard blend. This next one I'm going to show you is a dry brush on a wet paper. So it's basically like mixing wet on wet with a dry brush. It's really, God, I am bad at explaining things. Oh, look at that. Ooh. I probably should have waited a little longer, but it's okay. I still like it. Look at that. Look at that wet on dry with colors. It's beautiful. Anyway, so this next one I did is the wet paper with a dry brush with colors. I did this with all the steps because I wanted y'all to see the variations, and so y'all kind of know how the paint reacts when mixing them together, especially if you're like new to watercolor. I'm fairly new to watercolor. I started watercolor in December, maybe. My art teacher discovered that I had a very strong fear of watercolor and decided to make me use it for almost the rest of the year, and now I'm in love with it. So, conquer your fears. There's nothing to fear except for fear itself. Sorry, guys. So with this one, I basically did the dry paper with the dry brush with the colors, which by now y'all should know the pattern. I really like how that kind of blended together fairly well. I didn't really have a problem with it. So this next one, and honestly, I hate using these because it just makes such a mess, but the outcomes are worth it. So this is the salt technique. The first one I'm doing is wet on wet salt technique, but I put the salt down first. And depending on whatever you want, you can either put the paint down first and then the salt, or the salt down first and the paint. I don't use this technique very much because, as I said, I don't like how messy it makes everything. I still have salt on my desk, and I did this like 2-3 days ago. So this other one that I'm doing is the wet on dry, which is the dry paper. I don't know what it is. I'm horrible at explaining things. Another thing is with the salt techniques is you have to wait a really long time for it to dry. Like longer than normal, and it's because if you look where the paint is around the salt, it takes longer for it to dry, and I don't know why, but I had to wait a good hour for it to dry enough to where I could scrape it off and y'all could see the difference. So with these two, basically what I did is I put the paint down first, and then the salt, and it does make a difference. So there y'all have it. There are y'all's basic techniques. If y'all want to see this or want a copy of it, I have it posted on my Instagram.